What happens when a 13-year-old boy decides to speak out against the police who wrongfully arrested him? Can one child's voice change the course of justice? Jalen Carter's story is about courage, truth, and a fight for fairness. What happens when the system is forced to listen? Find out in this powerful tale of resilience and hope. Stay tuned to TH Voices of the Underdog for more. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The courtroom in Cleveland, Ohio, buzzed with the usual dull hum of routine. It was just another case. Another day. The kind of day where the air was thick with papers shuffling, pens scratching against legal pads, and murmurs of attorneys exchanging last-minute notes. It felt like any other day. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Judge Morris, sat calmly at the front, reviewing her docket as her gavel lay just inches from her fingertips. She was known for her stern demeanor, rarely reacting to anything that happened in her courtroom unless it was something truly worth noting. Jalen Carter, a 13-year-old boy, sat with his hands folded in front of him, his head hanging low. He was dressed in an oversized suit that didn't fit right, the sleeves too long and the pants too baggy. He was the kind of kid who had grown up on the streets of Cleveland, always keeping his head down, staying out of trouble. But trouble had found him. He had been arrested a few weeks ago under what seemed like unclear circumstances. The police officers claimed it was for suspicious behavior late at night, but the details of what actually happened had been vague, with no real explanation given. His mother had hired a lawyer, and now here they were, sitting in front of the judge for the trial. The defense attorney, Mr. Harris, a sharp-looking man with silver hair at his temples, sat confidently at the defense table. He didn't expect much from this trial. Another procedural step, another juvenile case, another boy lost in the system. On the other side of the courtroom, the prosecutor, Miss Holloway, was flipping through her notes, preparing to present the case against Jalen. She was serious, focused, and efficient. To her, this was just business as usual. No one in that room expected anything out of the ordinary. But then it happened. Jalen raised his head slowly, his eyes shifting nervously around the room. He cleared his throat and, in a voice that sounded much steadier than anyone anticipated, said, "The cops beat me." The words hung in the air like a bomb had just dropped. It was as though time itself had frozen. The entire courtroom went silent. Not a single sound could be heard for what felt like an eternity. Even the buzzing of the overhead lights seemed to fade into the background. The stenographer paused her typing, and the judge, usually so composed, sat frozen for a moment, her eyes locked on Jalen. It was the kind of moment where the room felt like it was holding its breath. No one had expected this. No one had seen it coming. Jalen had been quiet, nervous even, for most of the hearing. He was the kid who kept to himself, who was always told to let the adults handle things. But here he was speaking up, making a bold claim that no one had anticipated. Judge Morris, who was known for her no-nonsense approach, looked up from her papers, her gaze fixing on Jalen. She didn't blink. She didn't even move her head. She just stared at him as though trying to read something in his face that no one else in the courtroom could see. There was pain there, yes. Fear, too. But there was also something else, something deeper, something like determination. For a moment, the prosecutor, Miss Holloway, didn't know what to do. She sat still, her pen frozen in mid-air, her lips parted as though to object or dismiss what Jalen had just said, but no sound came out. The words felt too heavy. The claim was too serious to ignore, even though it came from a young, scared child. But this wasn't like other cases. Jalen wasn't crying, he wasn't stammering or trembling. His voice had been steady, and the look in his eyes, he wasn't backing down. Across the room, Officer Thomas Calloway, the arresting officer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face, usually so stern and unreadable, flickered with something. His jaw clenched slightly and his eyes darted to Jalen, then quickly away. He didn't say anything, but the discomfort in his posture was unmistakable. Jalen's guardian, Miss Lowry, sat beside him. She had been whispering to him earlier, telling him to stay quiet. She told him it was safer to let the lawyers handle everything, to let the professionals do the talking. Speaking out, she warned, might only make things worse. But now, she was gripping the edge of her seat, her breath caught in her chest. She was terrified, unsure if what Jalen had just done was the bravest thing he'd ever done, or the biggest mistake of his life. "Repeat that, please," Judge Morris finally said, her voice calm, almost too calm. She was still studying Jalen, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty, any flicker of hesitation that might suggest he was lying. But there was nothing. Nothing except the look of a boy who had been through something terrible and was now determined to make sure the world knew about it. Jalen swallowed hard, his hands clenched into tight fists on the wooden table. His knuckles turned white, but his voice didn't waver as he said again, "The cops beat me." In the back of the courtroom, there was a faint cough from one of the court officers. The sound felt jarring in the tense silence. All eyes were still on Jalen. The judge glanced over at the prosecutor, Miss Holloway, her gaze steady. "Was this mentioned in the reports?" Judge Morris asked, her voice clipped. Miss Holloway, who had been flipping through her files, hesitated for a moment before responding. "No, Your Honor. There's nothing in the report about any use of excessive force." Judge Morris's eyes narrowed, her attention returning to Jalen. "You're saying that the arresting officers used force against you?" Jalen nodded, his eyes briefly flickering toward Officer Calloway. The officer shifted again in his seat, but this time Jalen caught it. He saw it. The slight movement, the way Calloway's hands clenched tighter around the edge of his chair. "I'm saying they didn't want me to talk about it," Jalen continued, his voice now softer, but still as clear as before. His words sent another wave of tension through the room. A long pause followed. No one spoke. Not the lawyers, not the officers, no one. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor." "Overruled," Judge Morris said immediately, her eyes still locked on Jalen. It was clear that something told her this was just the beginning. Jalen could feel the weight of every eye on him. He had said it. He had said the truth that no one wanted to hear. And now, he knew the battle was only starting. The adults would try to twist his words, try to make him feel like he was crazy, like he was making everything up. But Jalen wasn't backing down. Not this time. This was just the start, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence him again. The room was still, the kind of stillness that hung in the air and made your skin crawl. Jalen's words echoed in the courtroom, a simple sentence that had caused a storm to brew in a place that was meant for calm and order. "The cops beat me." They weren't words of a child making up a story. They weren't just a cry for attention. They were an accusation. And suddenly the whole room had to listen. But no one in that courtroom, no one except Jalen, believed what had just been said. Not yet, anyway. His words were met with a mixture of disbelief, skepticism, and outright dismissal. Officer Eric Brooks, the very officer who had arrested Jalen, sat at the defense table, his posture rigid. His face was a mask of professionalism, though his jaw tightened just a fraction, a small twitch of emotion breaking through the calm. His eyes flickered briefly to Jalen, then quickly away. He didn't say anything, but it was clear that the accusation had shaken him. Next to him, the defense lawyer, Mr. Harris, quickly composed himself. He was an experienced attorney, someone who had seen many cases come and go, but this was different. The words had landed with such force that even he couldn't pretend they hadn't. After a brief moment of hesitation, he cleared his throat, and with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this would go, he stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Mr. Harris began, his voice smooth, "we believe that what this young man is claiming is simply a fabrication. A desperate attempt to deflect from the truth. A troubled child making up stories to avoid the consequences of his actions." He turned his head slightly, his eyes briefly meeting Jalen's before looking back at the judge. "This kind of accusation is serious. And we have nothing but the word of a scared boy who is clearly trying to manipulate the situation." The defense attorney's words were like a hammer striking the floor. They hit with weight, trying to diminish the validity of Jalen's claim. It was a tactic, and it was one that Jalen had seen before. In his neighborhood, the adults often told him how the system was stacked against people like him. People who didn't have the right connections. People who didn't fit the mold. And now, sitting in this courtroom, hearing the lawyer speak those words, Jalen realized that what he had been warned about was real. But Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He sat tall in his seat, staring at the defense attorney with a gaze that spoke volumes. He wasn't going to let them push him down. Not this time. On the other side of the room, the prosecutor, Miss Holloway, hadn't moved. She hadn't said anything yet. But her silence was louder than any words could have been. She looked down at her notes, tapping her pen nervously against the paper, her mind obviously racing through everything she had just heard. She was processing the accusation, evaluating its weight, deciding whether to respond or wait for more information. But before anyone could speak again, the judge, Judge Morris, turned to the prosecution. "Miss Holloway," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do we have any evidence to support this claim of excessive force?" Miss Holloway sat up straighter, her pen still in her hand. She looked up at the judge, then glanced over at Jalen. She could see the bruise on his neck, barely visible beneath the collar of his oversized shirt. She saw the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't just telling a story. There was something in his eyes. Something that said he wasn't making this up. "No, Your Honor," Miss Holloway said, a slight hesitation in her voice. "There is no mention of excessive force in the arrest report. The officers involved reported a standard procedure during the arrest, with no indication of violence or misconduct." She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "But," she continued, her voice trailing off, "I will admit that we are now questioning the validity of the reports." It was a small crack in the defense's armor, but it was enough. Judge Morris nodded, her gaze moving between the two attorneys, then landing back on Jalen. She studied him carefully, not as a judge observing a case, but as a woman who could see there was more to this than what was on the surface. "Mr. Harris," she said, her eyes narrowing, "you're suggesting that this young man is lying. But the question remains, why would he lie? What does he stand to gain by making such a claim?" Mr. Harris opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by the judge before he could say anything. And she added, "If his claim is false, why was this not addressed in the reports? Why are there no notes, no documentation of the injuries that are clearly visible now?" It was a sharp, pointed question, one that left no room for easy answers. The room went quiet again. No one dared to speak for a few moments. The weight of the question lingered in the air, thick with tension. Jalen could feel it. His stomach churned, but he didn't back down. He kept his eyes on the judge. He wasn't going to be silenced. Not today. The defense attorney was visibly frustrated now. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising a bit, "this is nothing more than a cry for attention. A scared kid, trying to cover up for his own poor decisions. And now we're going to entertain the idea that his word, without any supporting evidence, is enough to question the integrity of two law enforcement officers." He let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "I don't think so." Jalen felt a sudden rush of anger. He wanted to shout at them, tell them they were wrong, but he kept his mouth shut. His fingers gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles ached. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but he knew he had to hold it together. If he didn't, they'd write him off as just another angry kid. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp thud. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We will not derail this trial with accusations without merit. Mr. Harris, I expect you to present actual evidence, not assumptions. And Miss Holloway, I suggest you begin digging into the facts that have just been brought to light. We will continue with the proceedings, but I will not let this claim go unchecked." Jalen took a deep breath. He had hoped the judge would listen. He had hoped someone would believe him, and it seemed like maybe, just maybe, they were starting to. But the battle wasn't over yet. Far from it. The real fight had only just begun. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The arguments between the defense and prosecution were becoming more heated, but the focus had shifted to one question: could Jalen's words be trusted? Was this a simple accusation from an angry, confused child, or was there something darker beneath the surface? Everyone was on edge, waiting for the next twist in the case. But no one, not a single soul in that room, could have predicted what would happen next. It started with a shuffle at the back of the courtroom. A man, perhaps in his mid-40s with dark skin, wearing a worn-out bomber jacket, stood hesitantly by the door. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he looked around nervously, like he was second-guessing his decision to speak. His eyes scanned the room, and for a brief second, his gaze met Jalen's. There was something in the way they looked at each other, something unspoken, a quiet understanding. The judge, who had been leaning forward, elbows resting on her bench, noticed the movement immediately. "Yes," she asked, her voice stern but curious. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated for another moment before taking a slow step forward. I was there that night," he said, his voice rough but clear. "I saw what happened." The entire courtroom went silent. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the audience as they all turned to face the man. Malik Grant, the man who had just entered the room, stood in the spotlight now. His presence felt like a spark that had just ignited a fuse. The defense attorney, who had been looking as confident as ever, was the first to recover. He immediately stood, his face shifting into one of disbelief. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," the defense lawyer, Mr. Harris, said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We can't just allow some random bystander to interrupt the proceedings. This man has no place in this trial." Judge Morris raised a hand to silence him. "Let the man speak," she said. "We'll hear what he has to say." Malik's eyes flickered over to Officer Eric Brooks, who had been sitting stone still at the defense table, his eyes locked forward. It was a quick look, but Jalen noticed it. Calloway recognized Malik, and Malik knew it too. That fleeting recognition, that brief moment where their gazes met, was enough to tell Jalen that this was the same officer from that night, the one who had arrested him. Malik took a deep breath, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides as he spoke again. "I live on that block," he began. "I was walking back from my sister's house when I saw the cops pull up on the kid." He nodded toward Jalen, who was now sitting straighter in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The confirmation, the validation he needed. "At first, I didn't think much of it," Malik continued. "Cops stop kids all the time, but when I saw how they were handling him, it was different." The courtroom was still. The murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience, and even Jalen could feel a rush of emotion rise in his chest. Finally, someone was telling the truth. Someone had seen what happened, and now it couldn't be ignored. Malik's voice wavered slightly as he spoke again. "I saw them grab him. The kid didn't even pull away at first. He just froze. But they didn't try to talk to him, didn't try to figure out what was going on. They just slammed him against the wall. Jalen's breath caught in his throat. He knew this was the moment. The moment everything would change. The words from the prosecutor, Miss Holloway, seemed to come from far away as she jumped up, asking, "Did you see them strike him? Did you see the officers hit him?" Malik hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little more strained now. "One of them hit him. I don't know which one, but I saw a fist connect with his ribs. The kid was just gasping for air." Malik's eyes flickered toward Jalen once more, and Jalen could feel the weight of that gaze. There was a shared understanding, a shared truth between them now. The courtroom was in an uproar. The defense attorney immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, but Judge Morris raised a hand, cutting him off. "I will allow the witness to testify, Mr. Harris," she said sharply. "If you have an issue with this, we will address it after he has finished speaking." The defense lawyer looked like he had just been slapped. His mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to formulate a response, but nothing came out. The courtroom was focused on Malik, whose words were unraveling the carefully constructed narrative that had been built up until this moment. Jalen felt a surge of hope that he hadn't felt before. There was someone else who had seen the truth. There was someone else who knew exactly what had happened. Malik's voice grew more confident as he continued. "I saw them slam him against the wall. They told him to stop resisting, but he wasn't resisting. He was just scared. And then I saw them hit him again. It was like they were teaching him a lesson, not arresting him." Jalen closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the relief wash over him. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. For the first time, someone was confirming his version of events. He wasn't lying. He wasn't making it up. Someone had seen it, and now it couldn't be hidden anymore. The defense lawyer, realizing that his argument was crumbling, stood up again. "Your Honor," he said, his voice now tinged with desperation, "this is just one man's word. He could have been mistaken. He could have seen something else entirely." "How do we know he's telling the truth?" Judge Morris didn't hesitate. "Because his account matches the injuries that we see on the young man's body," she said, her voice unwavering. "Because the story that Jalen told us is now being confirmed by an eyewitness, and because no one has come forward to dispute what this man has just said." The prosecution's case had just been given new life. Malik's testimony was the turning point they had needed. It was the critical piece of evidence that turned Jalen's claim from a simple accusation into something that could no longer be dismissed. The bruises on Jalen's body, once overlooked or ignored, now served as undeniable proof of what had happened. The case had taken a dramatic turn, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object again, but Judge Morris silenced him with a single look. "We will continue with the trial, Mr. Harris," she said. "The witness will be added to the record." Jalen couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude toward Malik. He had come forward when it wasn't easy, when it was dangerous. He had risked everything to do the right thing. And now, because of his courage, Jalen's truth was no longer just a boy's word against the police. It was a case that could no longer be ignored. The trial had taken a turn, and this time, the system was finally going to listen. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and tension. Jalen Carter's words were no longer just a story. They were becoming undeniable truth. His testimony, combined with Malik Grant's brave account of what had happened that night, had turned the tide in the trial. But as the courtroom sat on edge, waiting for the next move, there was one crucial factor still hanging in the balance: the missing body cam footage. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Despite Malik's testimony, and despite the visible bruises on Jalen's body, there was still the issue of evidence. Without clear video footage from Officer Brooks's body cam, it seemed like the defense could still wriggle free. Officer Brooks, who had been sitting rigid at the defense table, suddenly seemed less confident. His jaw clenched, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and his eyes were glued to the table in front of him. It was the first time anyone had seen him even remotely uncomfortable. Jalen had seen enough of this look in his life, grown men, adults, trying to hide their guilt behind a mask of indifference. But Jalen wasn't backing down. He knew what had happened to him. And now, with Malik standing by his side with the bruises as proof, it felt like the truth was just a breath away from being laid bare for everyone to see. "Your Honor," said Miss Holloway, the prosecutor, as she stood up with a file in hand, "we've requested the body cam footage from Officer Brooks's arrest that night. Unfortunately, we were told that the footage was missing. However, after further investigation, we have obtained footage from a nearby patrol car that was on the scene that night." She turned toward the judge, her face stern, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "The footage clearly supports the testimony of our witness, Mr. Grant." Jalen held his breath as Miss Holloway handed over the video footage. The courtroom fell into a stillness as everyone waited for the screen to be set up. The defense team looked uneasy, exchanging glances, and even Officer Brooks shifted in his seat. It was as though the walls around him were slowly closing in. A few moments later, the video played on a projector, and the entire room watched in silence as the grainy footage came into view. The image was shaky at first, the camera likely positioned in the patrol car, but soon enough, the figures of two officers, one clearly identifiable as Officer Brooks, appeared on the screen. The footage showed Jalen walking down the alleyway, the red and blue lights flashing in the background. It was an ordinary scene at first, until the moment when the officers approached Jalen. The video clearly showed Officer Brooks grabbing Jalen's arm roughly, pulling him back when Jalen tried to step away, and slamming him against the wall. The room held its breath as the video continued. The audio was muffled, but the moment when Jalen was shoved into the wall could clearly be heard, the sound of his breath being knocked out of him as the officers towered over him. You could hear the brief exchange between Jalen and the officers, but what was most damning was the moment when the officer's fist came down. The video didn't capture the exact impact, but the quick motion of Officer Brooks's arm and the way Jalen's body jerked back gave enough context for everyone to understand. There was no denying it now. The footage aligned perfectly with Malik's testimony. It was undeniable. Officer Brooks had used excessive force. The defense had nothing left to say. The silence in the courtroom was thick. It was as though time had stopped for just a moment, and all eyes were now on Officer Brooks. The expression on his face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe fear, dancing behind his eyes. For the first time in the entire trial, Officer Brooks looked like a man who knew he was caught. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, his voice shaky, "this video footage. This cannot be used as evidence. It was not properly submitted, and we have no way of verifying its authenticity." He was grasping at straws now, trying to salvage what little he could. "This is a mistake." Judge Morris didn't even give him a second glance. "We will allow this video footage as evidence, Mr. Harris," she said firmly, her gaze shifting to the defense lawyer for only a moment before returning to the video. "The footage clearly supports the witness's account and the testimony of the victim. You're dismissed on that point." The defense lawyer opened his mouth, but no words came out. The game had changed. It was over. There was no room for doubt anymore. The truth was out in the open, and Officer Brooks couldn't hide behind his badge or his attorney any longer. "Your Honor," Miss Holloway said, standing a little straighter now, "based on the testimony of Mr. Grant, the video footage, and the physical evidence of the bruises on Mr. Carter's body, we are requesting that an independent investigation be launched into Officer Brooks's actions during this arrest." Jalen's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not just for the truth to come out, but for accountability to be served. For the system to see him, to acknowledge his pain and his experience instead of just brushing it aside. Judge Morris nodded slowly. An independent investigation will be conducted into Officer Brooks's actions during the arrest, she said, her voice authoritative. And in light of this new evidence, we will adjourn for today. We will reconvene once the investigation is complete. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of movement. The tension that had once been suffocating seemed to dissipate, but only just. Jalen could feel the weight of the room lifting off his shoulders, but he knew that the battle wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. There would be hearings, there would be more investigations, and there would be more scrutiny on Officer Brooks and his partner, Officer Denton. The wheels of justice were starting to turn, but it was going to take time. As Jalen stood up, he caught the eye of Malik, who was sitting behind him. Malik gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they were both in. Jalen felt a swell of gratitude toward him. Malik had put himself in the line of fire for this, and now, thanks to his courage, the truth was being seen. When Jalen left the courtroom that day, it was with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The bruises on his body had been proof, but now the video footage and Malik's testimony had ensured that the truth couldn't be swept under the rug. Officer Brooks might not have been arrested yet, but Jalen knew that he had taken the first step toward real justice, and that was a victory in itself. The courtroom was buzzing with energy as the final moments of the trial unfolded. Jalen sat at the defense table, his hands resting loosely in his lap, but his heart was racing in his chest. The tension that had hung in the room for days, weeks even, was now beginning to shift. It was a different kind of silence now, one that felt almost like relief was slowly creeping in, but it wasn't over yet. Jalen knew that the final gavel had not yet fallen. The judge, Judge Morris, had just announced her ruling. She had dismissed all charges against Jalen, officially declaring that the young boy was not guilty of any wrongdoing. The words had landed with a soft thud, but the meaning of them hit like a wave crashing against the shore. Jalen wasn't going to be labeled a criminal. He wasn't going to have that mark on his record for something he didn't do. The charges were dropped, but that was just the beginning. The battle wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about holding people accountable. It was about making sure that what had happened to him wasn't forgotten. The prosecutor, Miss Holloway, had immediately moved to request an official investigation into Officer Brooks's conduct during the arrest. The video footage, combined with Malik Grant's testimony and Jalen's own account, had made it clear that something wasn't right. Officer Brooks had used excessive force, and now the legal system had no choice but to address it. Jalen's mind was racing. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Would Officer Brooks be fired? Would he face criminal charges? For now, the officer was still sitting at the defense table, stone-faced, but Jalen could tell from the way his shoulders were tense that this wasn't over for him. It was only just beginning. But there was something else that Jalen couldn't shake, something deeper than the legal proceedings, something that had been bothering him since the beginning of the trial. He knew that this wasn't just about his case. It wasn't just about him. He was one small piece of a much larger puzzle. There were countless other kids, other people, who had been through the same thing, and maybe their stories had never been heard. Maybe their truth had never been acknowledged. Jalen stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He looked around the courtroom, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the people who had been there every day, watching as this small moment in history unfolded. He had seen the fear in their eyes, the skepticism and the doubt. But now, as he stood there, he saw something else. He saw respect. He saw the quiet understanding that something had changed here today. "Your Honor," Miss Holloway said, her voice steady now as she spoke to the judge. We request that an independent investigation into Officer Brooks's actions be initiated immediately. We believe that this case should be treated with the seriousness it deserves. We also request that the department take immediate action to ensure that this kind of misconduct is not tolerated. Jalen watched as the judge nodded, her gavel ready in her hand. "Motion granted," Judge Morris said, her voice firm. "An independent investigation into Officer Brooks's actions will be conducted immediately. This case is adjourned." And just like that, the room erupted in a flurry of movement. The attorneys began gathering their papers, the stenographer stood to gather her notes, and the bailiff began ushering people out of the room. But for Jalen, time felt like it had stopped. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the gavel in the judge's hand, as if the finality of it was too much to process. Miss Lowry, his guardian, walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. She had been a rock throughout this whole process, but now she had a look on her face that Jalen couldn't quite read. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that felt complete. It was bittersweet. "You did it," she said softly. "You made them listen." Jalen swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yeah," he muttered. "I did." But as he said it, he realized that it wasn't just about this case, it was about something bigger. The fight for justice, for truth, for what was right, it was bigger than him. And this was just one battle in that war. He stepped out of the courtroom with Miss Lowry, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. The noise of the city outside, the people going about their lives, it all felt so distant, like Jalen was in a different world. A world where justice had been served, but the scars still remained. The bruises on his body weren't gone. The trauma he had experienced wasn't erased by a few simple words or a ruling in his favor. But for the first time in a long time, Jalen felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for people like him. They walked out into the bright sunlight, and Jalen felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't a perfect victory. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step forward. And in a world where so many voices went unheard, Jalen had made his voice count. Later that evening, as Jalen lay in bed, his mind raced through everything that had happened that day. He thought about Officer Brooks and whether or not he would face any real consequences. He thought about Malik, who had risked everything to come forward, and about the other people who had been through similar experiences but didn't have the courage to speak out. He thought about the fight for justice, and he realized something important today. He had won. But tomorrow there would be another fight. There would always be another fight, and for every victory there would be another battle to face. But Jalen knew something else too. The next time someone told him to be quiet, to stay in his place, he would remember this moment. He would remember that sometimes speaking out made all the difference. And that, no matter how hard the fight was, it was always worth it. As he closed his eyes, Jalen smiled to himself. He wasn't just a kid in a courtroom anymore. He was someone who had fought for his truth. And today, that truth had been heard. The story of Jalen Carter was just beginning, and it was a story that would resonate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The world was changing, and he was part of that change.